Welcome to today's episode of Talk on Things and Stuff. I am your host, John Streeter, and today we're going to continue our series on Stewart Udall, and I want to try to see if I can get through the whole series by the end of this month, and if I can, we'll also explore the letters of Lowry Nelson and a few other of the articles that deal with the issue of race in Mormonism from the Thoughts on Things and Stuff website. I have my co-host Yu-Gi-Oh here, who promises that he will be well behaved. I kind of doubt it. But at any rate, let's keep going. So let's pull up here. You can find the articles that we're going through if you go to thoughtsonthingsandstuff.com and you Google the Stewart Udall sequence. Yugi, I'm going to need you to be quiet if we're going to do this. You got to chill. Okay. All right. So let's see here. We're going to go full Uh-oh. All right. I can already tell there's going to be a problem. So Yugi's girlfriend, Millie, thinks that she's going to be all that. Hold on just a second. Okay, I got to do this recording, dude. Okay. All right, we've eliminated some of those variables. Okay, so let's proceed. You can go to the Stewart Udall sequence. We're going to scroll down. There was part 1 where we learned who Stewart Udall was. Part 2 where he wrote a letter to the brethren about the issue of being confronted with people critical of the church's policy on race. Part 3 where he wrote a letter that was published in Dialogue. Got a few positive responses to him calling for the church to end its priesthood restrictions and the racist doctrine around them. And then yesterday we went through part 4, where we got to see the collection of letters of members who, believing that they were defending the truth and defending the church, wrote critically to Udall about his letter and his activism, and revealed a little bit of the heart of Mormons at that time. And we saw echoes of those sentiments in today. And today we're going to go over part 5, the Apostles and the Primitive Church, where we see what the apostles themselves wrote to Udall. So let's go ahead and start. And again, I'm going to read the article, and there may be times where I have to stop and restart, and that's okay. If you'll just bear with me, we'll start from there. Stewart Udall, Sequence 5. The Apostle and the... Starting again. Stewart Udall, Sequence 5. The Apostles and the Primitive Church. In parts 1 through 4 of this series, we were introduced to Jack Mormon Stewart Udall. Early in his life, he made a conscience-based separation from Mormon orthodoxy, yet continued to stand up for what he believed was right. His career eventually found him Secretary of the Interior, the highest-ranking Mormon government official. At the time, he wrote an open letter calling for the end of the LDS Church policy on banning black members from priesthood ordination. In our last post, we reviewed the body of letters that Udall received from fellow church members in response to his appeal. I encourage you to review them. Modern members may be incredulous that such ideas would be held by members in the past, or may assume that those members who wrote Udall were statistical outliers, extremists on the fringe of Mormon thought regarding race and equality at the time. Imagine a great conference with all the church leaders on the podium and all the members in the pews. Udall stands up and boldly declares that the racist notion of a curse is wrong, and the prohibition of priesthood to the black members is wrong. While a few people seated right around him nod in agreement, the whole majority of the membership shouts him down. They defend the racist teachings. They chastise him for embarrassing the church. They tell him he should leave and join some other congregation. They insult his intelligence and family. All the while, the leaders look on. Then a hush settles over the crowd as two apostles stand to respond to Udall's brazen statement. We could tell if the members were out of line by comparing their statements with those of the leaders. Would the apostles echo the sentiments of the members, or would they take a different tone? Fortunately, we have a way to find out. In addition to receiving letters from fellow church members, Udall also received letters from the two acting LDS apostles who hailed from his home state of Arizona, Spencer W. Kimball and Delbert L. Stapley. Udall had sent them copies of his letter prior to publication. Let's examine what they had to say. Spencer W. Kimball. Just a few days after Udall's letter was published, LDS Apostle Spencer W. Kimball wrote to him in response. I recommend you read the letter, available at archive.org, and draw your own conclusions as to its content. I will include the text below with some of my own commentary. Reading from the letter, quote, Dear Stewart, these days papers and magazines are flooded with articles relating to this matter, written by people relatively unknown. Most of them are rehashes. All of them show a woeful ignorance of the subject they so presumptuously attempt to treat. I never dignify any of them with a reply or comment, but you have sent me a copy of your letter to President McKay with a personal note attached. I'm acknowledging that note and my brief reply to you. I'm acknowledging that note and my brief reply is to you personally. That's the end of that part of the letter. Now, it's interesting to note that the dignity of an apostle of Jesus Christ is above responding to people who ask publicly why the church had adopted policies and teachings which are now disavowed as racist and erroneous. It may be that if the apostles were concerned less about their own dignity and more about truth and integrity, there would have been a shorter period of sanctioned racism in the church. In any event, the high visibility of Udall's letter demanded a response, and Spencer W. Kimball obliged. Reading again from the letter. Quote, Stewart, I cannot believe it. You wouldn't presume to command your God, nor to make demand of a prophet of God. I wish you had edited it after, I wish you had edited it after fasting and prayer. I'm not surprised at the browns and the greens and the blacks, for they perhaps do not know better. But you, with your background, and that's the end of that part of the letter. Now recall from our review of the letters sent by members to Udall that there were several common themes. One of these was the idea that Udall's letter was particularly bad because it showed that Udall didn't know his place as a member. By calling for a change in the policy and teachings, Udall was interpreted as lecturing the prophet or assuming to know better than the heads of the church. Here, Kimball is chastising Udall for the same reason. It is interesting to note that in Kimball's view, there is not difference between commanding God or making demands of the prophet. He's not reprimanding Udall for standing against racism, but for calling for a change and presuming to tell the prophet that the policy and teachings are wrong, a great sin for a Mormon. Now, continuing reading from the letter from Kimball to Udall. Quote, For days now I have deliberated long and earnestly, trying to assess a motive. It couldn't be politics, you would not stoop to that. It couldn't be money, you have enough for your needs. Surely it couldn't be for prestige and renown, you have that in great abundance. It couldn't be for hate or revenge or disloyalty, I am sure. I know you have regard for your forebears and for your people. I've kept waiting to think, I've kept wanting to think it was the result of a sincere but ill-advised effort in behalf of the welfare of a minority. I have tried to believe that you just did not understand. And that's the end of that part of the letter. Now, it speaks volumes to the mind of a Mormon apostle of Christ where the motive of a man calling for universal brotherhood is questioned as such. Only after excluding wealth, fame, power, or revenge did Kimball conclude that Udall may simply be standing up for the welfare of a minority. But then Kimball tells Udall that such a motive is ill-advised and uninformed. Reading again from the letter. Quote, I have watched you climb to high places in the secular world. I've seen your picture numerous times in countless places. I've read many of your pronouncements, and in much that you have done and said, I have been proud of you. But, my dear Stewart, neither your eminence in secular matters nor your prominence in government circles has justified you in any such monumental presumption. You are here with a little boulder in your hand, but out there beyond this earth is a sun, a galaxy, a universe. You two have clothed this whole matter in ragged human apparel. And that's the end of that part of the letter. The appeal to authority rhetorical fallacy is one in which an argument is justified by attributing it to a supposed authority. Here, Kimball is warning Udall against that fallacy by observing that just because Udall holds a position of prominence does not justify his call for a change. Kimball is unfortunately blind to his own appeal to authority, i.e., to himself. Racist policies are not justified simply because the prophet and apostles say so. Kimball reminds Udall that while he is only looking at the issue from the perspective of a human grounded in the temporal world, the church leaders have a wider, universal view of creation and God's plan, a view in which the religious segregation and denigration of an entire race of humans is completely justified and divine. Continuing with Kimball's letter to Udall, quote, to such presumption I must quote the Lord, quote, and thou shalt not command who, starting again, and thou shalt not command him who is at thy head and at the head of the church, unquote. Doctrine and Covenants, section 28, verse 6. Stewart, I earnestly hope this note may be for your good. I'm not angry with you. I'm sorry for you. Sincere, kind wishes. Spencer Kimball. Now, Kimball was courteous, at least, in reprimanding Udall for his presumption to lecture the brethren. The idea, starting again, this idea that members have no right to instruct the leaders of the church is still very much alive and well. It is the main argument against the ordained women movement. Delbert Stapley. Delbert Stapley was another apostle from Udall's home state of Arizona. Stapley was no stranger to this issue, having previously written to Michigan Governor George Romney, reprimanding him for his position on civil rights. You can read about that letter in the blog post titled George Romney and the Delbert Stapley Letter. In that letter, Stapley issued a sort of dire divine threat. Starting again. In that letter, Stapley issued a sort of dire divine death threat to Romney. Let's examine Stapley's letter to Udall and see what approach he took. You can view the original letter at archive.org, and I encourage you to read it first and come to your own conclusions. We will review the text below with commentary. Now, reading from the letter. Quote, Dear Stu, thanks for your thoughtfulness sending me a copy of your letter dated May 16th to President David O. McKay. Also, a copy of your article, An Appeal for Full Fellowship for the Negro, which is to appear in the Dialogue magazine. This article you released to the press for national consumption. No one will question your right to make such a statement, but I sincerely believe that you should have submitted the article here to determine the facts before releasing it to the press, because there are some misstatements. Your statement has done the church a great disservice. Any misunderstandings within the church should be ironed out among ourselves and not paraded before the world. Now, that's the end of that part of the letter. Stapley is echoing the sentiment that many of the letters from members held, thou shalt not embarrass the church. Continuing with the letter from Stapley to Udall, quote, I can visualize your article being a stumbling block to George Romney if he decides to run for president. It certainly creates many difficult problems to him and any other church member seeking state or national office. We in the church must remember that instruction and guidance come down from above and not from below. Otherwise, this church would be just another church. And that's the end of that part of the letter. So in addition to the worldly concerns about in addition to the worldly concerns about church members obtaining national political office, Stapley reiterates, as many members did, that in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, members must know their place and not presume to know better than the leaders. Of course, looking back in retrospect, if the leaders had been humble and teachable in listening to members such as Stewart Udall, Jeff Nye, and Lowry Nelson, then they would have escaped out from under the error of their predecessors decades sooner. This notion of leaders never learning from the body of the membership of the church has kept Mormons years behind the rest of the world in progress on many social issues. Reading again from the letter from Stapley to Udall, quote, "As you know, the Apostle Paul, writing to the Corinthian saints, said that the things of men are understood." Starting again. "As you know, the Apostle Paul, writing to the Corinthian saints, said that the things of man are understood by the Spirit of man, but the things of God are understood by the Spirit of God. Man does not know the mind and will of God. Therefore, he is not in position to declare against the things which God has revealed." Anytime members, so that's the end of that part of the letter. Now, anytime members point out injustice or inconsistencies in church teaching, scripture, or policy, you can bet that some leader somewhere is going to pull out this particular trope. Since the church leaders are the only ones with the blessing of being the spokesperson for God, they have the privilege of defying logic and reason and then claiming a special divine exception for doing so. We can now look back in history and acknowledge all of the things these leaders were attributing to God about race are now considered false and disavowed. This means that those church leaders did not themselves know the mind of God, and that their claim to understand by the Spirit of God was baseless. The implications for today's church leaders is unavoidable. They have no credibility in claiming to speak the mind or will of God. Embarrassingly, Stapley goes on to demonstrate that this disconnect with God extends as far back in church history as the prophet Joseph Smith himself. Reading from the letter, quote, "In this article, you stated that the prophet Joseph Smith was pro-Negro. I don't think the prophet was against the Negroes. However, it appears you are not familiar with some of the statements made by him concerning this race of people. In his teachings, as compiled by President Joseph Fielding Smith, page 269, under Status of the Negro, we find the following statement recorded. Quote, "At 5, went with Mr. Sollers and with Elders Hyde and Richards. Elder Hyde inquired the situation of the Negro. I replied, they came into the world slaves, mentally and physically. Change their situation with the whites, and they would be like them. They have souls and are subjects of salvation. Go into Cincinnati or any city and find an educated Negro who rides in his carriage, and you will see a man who has risen by the powers of his own mind to his exalted state of respectability. The slaves in Washington are more refined than many in high places, and the black boys will take the shine off many of those they brush and wait on." Elder Hyde remarked, "We'll put them on the level and they will rise above me." I replied, "If I raised you to be my equal and then attempted to oppress you, would you not be indignant and try to rise above me as Oliver Cowdery did, Peter Whitmer, and many others who said I was a fallen prophet? And they were capable of leading the people, though I never attempted to oppress them, but have always been lifting them up." Then this significant statement, "Had I anything to do with the Negro, I would confine them by strict law to their own species and put them on a national equalization." Again, in the History of the Church, Volume 2, commencing at page 436, the prophet expresses his views on abolition. I am attaching here to this statement and ask you to pay particular attention to the last paragraph on page 438, which I have underlined. Now, that's the end of that part of Stapley's letter to Udall. Now, in this last citation, Stapley is quoting the same paragraph he used to issue the divine death threat to Governor George Romney just 3 years previously. This is the paragraph he's referring to. Trace the history of the world from this notable event down to this day, and you will find the fulfillment of this singular prophecy. What could have been the design of the Almighty in this singular occurrence is not for me to say, but I can say the curse is not yet taken off from the sons of Canaan, neither will be until it is affected by as great a power as caused it to come. And the people who interfere the least with the purposes of God in this matter will come under the least condemnation before him. And those who are determined to pursue a course which shows an opposition and a feverish restlessness against the decrees of the Lord will learn, when perhaps it is too late for their own good, that God can do his own work without the aid of those who are not dictated by his counsel. This is taken from History of the Church, Volume 2, page 438, which can be found on BYU's website. Now, you can read how Stapley used this same paragraph to warn George Romney that those who support racial equality may find themselves shot or drowned or worse in the blog post George Romney and the Delbert Stapley letter. He's implying that people who oppose the racist teachings of the church will be punished for doing so. Next, Stapley provides scriptural justification for church policy. He cites the verses in Abraham which refer to the curse which precluded some people from the priesthood. Specifically, Abraham, chapter 1, verses 21 through 27. Reading from the letter, Stapley states, also refer to Abraham, first chapter, the 21st to the 27th verses inclusive. Now, it's worth noting that this entire concept has now been disavowed by the church in the Race and the Priesthood essay. Moving on to the issue of segregation specifically, Delbert Stapley, Apostle of Jesus Christ, goes on to lecture Udall about how the scriptures demonstrate that God himself supports racial segregation. Reading from the letter, quote, Now, Stewart, you know the Lord has a chosen people who stem through the loins of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the 12 sons of Jacob. The children of Israel were forbidden by the Lord to take wives, not only from the descendants of Cain and Ham, but from the other nations among whom the children of Israel sojourned. The Apostle Peter said of them, quote, Ye are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, an holy nation, a peculiar people, that ye should show forth the praises of him who hath called you out of darkness into this marvelous light, which in times past were not a people, but are now the people of God, which had not obtained mercy, but now have obtained much. In Exodus chapter 6, the 7th verse, the Lord said, And I will take you to me for a people. It was through Israel, particularly through his son Joseph, that all nations of the earth were to be blessed in the latter days. Now, can we accuse God of not knowing what he is doing? Because he does not agree with the concepts of man today. Starting again. Because he does not agree with the concept of man today doesn't prove him wrong. The atheist, or the non-Christian, does not prove that the Savior was not the Son of God, our lawgiver, Redeemer, and King. What God does, man should not attempt to interfere. God himself placed the curse upon the Negro, and is up to him and not to man to lift that curse. The church cannot lift the restriction against the Negro until God authorizes it. As to the timing, or if it ever occurs, we do not know, but must assume that if a Negro accepts and lives the gospel, even though there may be some limitations, his opportunities eternally place him in a more favorable position to be rewarded for his faithfulness. We have many Negro members in the church, and the greater part of them are very faithful and devoted, yet are cognizant of their limitations. We try to be helpful to those who become church members, because men want to change the order God has ordained does not mean that the good Lord will approve. And that's the end of that part. part of the letter from Stapley to Udall. Now we can see that the apostles have taught the members well, because Stapley is using the exact same arguments that those irate members used in writing to Udall. The idea that God himself supports segregation. The excuse that black members are aware of and accept the teachings and prohibition on priesthood ordination is another example. The notion that members cannot rightly instruct the prophet as to do what is right, yet again seen in those letters, and all of these ideas were seen in those letters that members sent, starting again. The notion that members cannot rightly instruct the prophet as to what is right, all of these ideas were seen in the letters that members sent to Udall, and all are seen here as originating from the highest levels of church leadership. The leaders create the culture. Stapley goes on to demonstrate that he can both respect black people and support segregation and white supremacy. Stapley goes on to demonstrate that he can both respect black people and support segregation and white supremacy in the same breath. Reading again from the letter, quote, "Now, our company employs Negroes. One has been with us for over 35 years. We hold these Negro employees in high regard and place much confidence in them. I don't want you to think I hold anything against the Negro, but I fully support the teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith and the teachings of the Lord as given to Father Abraham. The extremists of modern religious and social thought mentioned by you does not justify repudiating the counsels and the acts of our God. You know as well as I do that all men are not created equal. We learn this fact from the book of Abraham also. It is true we may have equal rights, opportunities, and privileges, but that doesn't mean that we are all equally endowed. We have leaders, we have followers, and those in between. Some are rich, some are poor. Some enjoy good health, some are weighted down by their physical ailments. Because the people among whom Christ lived did not receive him as their Lord and Redeemer doesn't disprove his divine status. There are hundreds of millions of people who do not believe in the Christ, and many who do not believe in God, but that doesn't prove they both do not exist. And that's the end of that part of the letter. It is particularly interesting that Stapley states, "You know as well as I do that all men are not created equal." Now this betrays one of the most revered documents of our nation, the Declaration of Independence, which reads, quote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." That's from the Declaration of Independence at archive.org. Stapley states that, sure, all men may have equal rights, but they are not equally endowed with intelligence or other aspects. In making this distinction, Stapley is actually reinforcing the principles upon which white supremacy are based, that black people are less capable, moral, or intelligent because of their race alone. This is ugly, despicable stuff. To see a man claiming to be a special witness of Christ repudiate a member of the church who has called for the dignity and equality of races in such a manner is revolting to the senses of any Christian mind. Stapley continues his letter, quote, "I am including a recent letter addressed to President David O. McKay, written by John E. Olson, Jr., medical doctor, dated May 2nd, 1967. Now, Stu, this, starting again, hold up, my phone is sabotaging me. Now, Stu, this letter is for your own consumption. I don't believe anyone here intends to excite controversy over your article. It would only add fuel to the fire, and nothing is to be gained. This outburst is unfortunate." And that's the end of that part of the letter. Stapley correctly observes that if the church leadership were to respond to Udall's letter, it would only make matters worse. That is because of the simple truth that Stapley's letter is the substance of what any response would be: a reinforcement of racist doctrines, support of segregation and religious white supremacy, and a condemnation of members presuming to lecture the brethren on what is right. These would not play well on the public stage. The letter that Stapley refers to can be viewed at archive.org. It's a brilliant example of the slobbering, sycophantic prose which praises the wonderful leadership of the prophets and apostles, which were chosen by the Lord, while at the same time ridiculing self-appointed so-called intellectuals and progressive Mormons for asserting the equality of men and naming the alleged Negro and priesthood problem. No doubt that Stapley was providing an example of the sort of attitude a good Mormon should have in deference to his leaders. Stapley continued from the letter. A few other brethren have been guilty of attempting to destroy the image of the church. I am sure the work of the Lord will continue to go forward because of the destiny of his latter-day kingdom. Starting again. I am sure the work of the Lord will continue to go forward because the destiny of his latter-day kingdom is clear. In spite of oppositions and roadblocks, the good Lord will look after his own. I have this confidence and testimony. This letter does not require an answer. I'm writing accepting full personal responsibility for it. I appreciate my friendship with you and the Udall families, for whom I have great love and respect. P.S. Again, I request that this letter, or any part of it, is not given to the press, nor is the letter to be used in any way. You are a member of the church, and I thought that you personally should have the information I am sending you. It is not to be shared with anyone else. The present national situation will be greatly aggravated should it fall into other hands. I know I can trust you with its contents. Signed, Delbert Stapley. Now, it is notable that Stapley lumps Udall in with, quote, other brethren, quote, who are guilty of attempting to destroy the image of the church. This reveals that, unlike Kimball, Stapley presumes to know the motive of Udall. Rather than, as Kimball did, giving Udall the benefit of the doubt of mistakenly standing up for a disadvantaged minority, Stapley assumes that his intention was to damage the image of the church. He goes on to preach a sermon of the persecuted yet triumphant church. In this, he is completely blinded to the fact that it is the church's own policy which had enacted a persecution of those black men and women who were unfortunate enough to accept the teachings about their less valiant and cursed nature. Conclusion. Mormons believe that their church holds the same organizational hierarchy as existed in the church established by Christ and his apostles in the meridian of time, the primitive church. These letters show that whatever the organization, the church was primitive, but for other reasons altogether, with men such as Kimball and Stapley in authority. When reading the letters sent by members to Udall, it may be tempting to assume that those were the isolated sentiments of fringe members. These letters, from sitting apostles, reveal that, in fact, the members were acting in a manner consistent with their leaders, who endorsed the exact same arguments and held out the same outdated, primitive, racist notions in their own letters to Udall. In any organization, the leaders have the ability to affect the culture of the members. This is particularly true of groups with a rigid, top-down hierarchy, such as the Mormon Church. Members show such great deference to the leaders that it is completely disingenuous to say that the priesthood ban was kept in place because the membership of the church was too racist to accept it, and the leaders had to wait for the membership to awaken to equality. Yet this very excuse has been given to me as a cause for the late removal of the ban on a number of occasions. The fact of the matter is that if the members held racist views, it was because they were empowered to hold them by the leaders, and those notions were further reinforced by a culture which condemned questioning of authority or divergence of thought. The lesson of these apostolic letters to Stewart Udall is that the leaders themselves held racist views, taught them, and reproved anyone who rejected those ideas. It would be just a couple of decades later that the church would publish an article presuming to lecture the world about the evils of racism. In order to have the air of legitimacy and moral authority, the author blatantly whitewashed history, declaring that the Mormon Church has never been racist. From that article, a quote, "How grateful I am that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has from its beginnings stood strongly against racism in any of its malignant manifestations." That's a quote from Alexander Morrison of the Quorum of the 70 from the article No More Strangers, published in the Ensign in September 2000, can be found on LDS.org. It is no different now than it was back then. The image and appearance of the church and its leaders is more important than truth. Men claiming to be special witnesses of Christ should be held to a higher standard when it comes to their teachings of how men and women should act and feel towards their neighbors, regardless of race. The letters of Kimball and Stapley reveal that in the Mormon Church, it is the image and authority of the organization which are the prime concern of the leaders, not love or justice. Members who are unteachable, who refuse to take any counsel but their own, and who condemn any critic, are justifiably considered stubborn and prideful. What is to be thought of church leaders who exhibit the same symptoms and yet are revered for it? Next. In the next and final part of this series, we will examine the fruit that was born of Mormonism around the time of Stewart Udall and compare it to the fruit that other faiths were bearing, with the example of a remarkable young woman with much the same spirit of Mr. Udall. And that is the end. All right. Okay. Whew. All right, let's go ahead and open up the phone lines. If anyone is interested in commenting on it, they can do that. Give me just a second to set that technology up. Hold on just a second. We'll return shortly. Okay. All right, I think we are ready to go. If you would like to offer any commentary on what we just read or observations on the subject matter at hand, that is really the issue of race in Mormonism and how it has been treated by leaders in the past and its repercussions, the echoes that we're feeling today, then please feel free to call in. The number is 210-422-2222. I can hear Yu-Gi-Oh in the background going crazy because he wants to be out here. He's just too loud and rowdy right now. I was gone over the weekend, so he's missed me. He loved me. All right, let's look at some of the comments that we received. In the meantime, hold on, we got a call. Hello, you're on Talk on Things and Stuff.
Hey, good morning.
Good morning. What's on your mind?
Well, I thought it was interesting because, having my morning cup of coffee, I put this on and I'm like, oh, wow, racism. I grew up, did you grow up during the time of the Lamanite program?
No, I grew up as the children of converts outside of Utah. So I was out in the mission field and I didn't know any of this racist history of the church existed till I started studying.
Yeah. And I grew up in the church generations. I'm one of the very few that has left the church in my family. And, I got a phone call from my grandma that I'm an apostate and I've lost my family. I'm going to lose my husband. And I'm like, promise? Okay. So it was really hard, actually. Yeah. It was very sad. It was very painful. And that was I left the church about 5 years ago. Okay. And I'm 46. So I was born and raised, grew up, had all the shame and everything that went along with it. But I grew up during the Lamanite program. The church kind of went into business with the government where they were taking the Native American children out of their homes and to take away pretty much their culture and their language and raising them in white families.
No, you're talking
And
about the Indian placement program
yes,
that I think a lot of
yeah,
members referred to as the Lamanite program, because at that time it was acting on this teaching or this idea in the church that the Native Americans were the Lamanite descendants, and
yep,
so
exactly.
it was a system to raise them out of the squalor of their dark and cursed state, essentially.
Yes, and that as they received the gospel, their skin became light and delightsome.
Yes.
And I had a foster brother when I was younger. I don't want to say his name because I don't want to,
But your
cause him trouble.
Your family participated, and they took one of these into their home?
Yes, and he was a sweetheart, very shy young man. I was like around 7 years old,
Yeah.
and he was probably around 8 or 9. I mean, they're little kids, and they're taken away from their families. And
Yeah.
I was raised with an aunt who I thought was my aunt. I didn't know she was Native American. I just thought she had a great California tan. And I did, because that's how I saw her. I saw her as my aunt. I didn't see the skin color difference or anything like that. And she was, Navajo, and she was raised in my grandmother's house from the time that she was a little girl until she was, into college. She went home every once in a while, saw her family, but it was so incredibly hard because their culture is so different. Yeah. And there was a lot of abuse going on, but it was to make them light and delightsome and to pretty much, in a way, eliminate a lot of their culture, because a lot of them still practice the Navajo way, the religious beliefs and stuff, which is perfectly fine. That's their culture. So I grew up with that mentality of, that was normal. And when I found out that they had other families, it made me so sad as a child. A young adult when I found out, really. Yeah. And I still am in contact with my aunt to this day, and we've talked about her briefly, and it's very hard. It's very hard. But the racism there was, in a very, I think, in a skewed manner where it's layered with some nice frosting. Yeah. Of the light and delightsome, the Lamanites, and very painful. And I was also raised during the time, I was born in 1974, so that meant Black people did not get the priesthood until, right. 78?
78.
Was it 78?
Yeah.
And so in growing up, I was not allowed to date any Black guys.
Yeah.
And
that's part of the issue where even when the church lifted the ban, it continued to teach this anti-miscegenation idea where you're not supposed to mix the races. And so that persisted, right, even past the ban.
Well, and even my father at the time, who was a bishop, told me, he's just like, no, they still carry the mark of Cain, even though they are now, fully accepted, and they have the priesthood and they have all the blessings. We just don't do that. And so I just thought that was, it kind of tore at me, like there's something wrong here. And then I think as I started to learn more when I exited the church, going through and reading a lot of the works from the church, I can't remember that set of books that was put out. I have the whole set. I can't remember it, but going through that and reading and how Black people what they were referred to or as after, I think, Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith was very, I think, reading the history, he was very kind and compassionate to the Black people, especially people who were escaping slavery, and he welcomed them in. A lot of the other brethren, Brigham Young and others, did not like it. They were very much racist. Yeah. And when Joseph Smith died, because Joseph Smith even gave them the priesthood. Yeah. And then when Joseph Smith died, Brigham Young was just like, no, we're taking this away. And they became like a second-class citizen all over again. And it was really hard when I read the words from Brigham Young and others
Yeah, you
in the
have like
church.
President Taylor, who was an apostle, said that, blacks existed because Satan, this whole opposition and all things, Satan needed to have people who represented him on the earth. And that's why, the son of Ham was able to come through the flood. There's just all sorts of really
Yeah,
reprehensible quotes.
yeah, that, and I think one of the saddest ones I read was that and 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 this is their words. The Negro exists so that, because he can never go to the highest kingdom on his own merits, but he can go there as a servant to the white man.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've read that, but that was very powerful. When I read that, I thought, wow, that is just so incredibly unfair.
And we saw the fruit of that doctrine in the life of Jane Manning James, who petitioned the brethren multiple times to be able to be sealed to her own family in the temple. And when they finally did grant a form of sealing, it was to have her sealed as an eternal servitor to Joseph Smith. So that was just put in practice the doctrinal principle that you just articulated, which is that black people could go to the highest kingdom, but they would be there as servants.
Yeah, and I can see how the church later on would backpedal and say, you know what, they had to say that, they had to do that because it wasn't accepted, but she will be, an exalted wife and mother in the next kingdom. There's a play on words and how they, I think, sanitize the truth of things, and people, I look at the people and I'm like, you know what, they grew up in a very different time. A lot of these people had things ingrained in them, racism, and it's sad that it carried through into gospel literature and doctrine, and into generations. But it that was one of the it wasn't one of the tipping points for me, because it had already tipped for me.
Oh, really?
Reading I think when I read the journals of the young women that Joseph Smith approached for marriage, the 14-year-olds and such, that was my tipping point, because I was like, that no prophet of God is gonna, no worthy man would act such a way
And attribute it to God.
Yeah, I was just like that. I wouldn't let any man like that be around my children, my daughter. And so why would that be acceptable even then for me? So I was just like, no, this is not a holy person. That was my tipping point. But
I think a lot of what you've related draws me back to this idea that doctrine has consequences. And so when we look at the experience of the Lamanite placement program or the Indian placement program, the only thing that justifies that is this notion of cultural white supremacy that says that we are going to take these people in their fallen state, bring them into our righteous households, and show them how to be respectable people before God. And that has the effect of stripping them of their own family cultural heritage. And it's able to cast that cultural heritage aside because they're dehumanized. There's
absolutely
a brilliant activist named Sarah Newcomb who's put together a website called Lamanite Truth. If you just Google Lamanite Truth, you can see some reflection on this state of the racist legacy of Mormonism and how it's affected Native American cultures. And in a way where, a lot of times when we speak about racism and Mormonism, a lot of the attention is placed on black people of African descent because of the priesthood ban itself. But the doctrinal implications found in the Book of Mormon and how that has affected Native cultures outside of black descendants of Africa is also just as significant and just as deplorable. And it starts with the whole idea that the Book of Mormon strips them of their actual cultural heritage and imparts a 19th century religious fiction as to where they came from, how they, what their cultural legacy is. And so anything that their own culture may have had that was the product of its own natural evolution is discarded as trash and replaced with this fake substitute, and then they have to act on it. And as you correctly observed, many of those houses, because these innocent, vulnerable children were placed in houses where there was unaccountable exposure to people who may have been sexual predators. We're seeing more and more stories of young boys and girls that were placed into these homes and then were
Yeah.
physically and sexually abused, and there was no one that they could turn to because they were completely left helpless and isolated.
What I also thought was interesting, and it ties into a lot of things, was the renaming of the children. They've been given white names, Americanized names, or Anglo-Saxon names. And I thought it was interesting that you had the same thing. You get the same thing in the church when you go through the temple. You get a new name. It's really kind of erasing your identity to say this is who you are, and this is how you have to fit in. And if you don't, then you don't have the Spirit with you, or something's wrong, or you don't understand. And it's a very manipulative tactic, and it carries the roots of deceit, just carry through in so many ways that it's really sickening when you see it all. When you look back and you dig up this tree, and the roots go so deep and far. So yeah,
it's one of the experiences I think that anyone who grew up in the era that you and I did, when you start studying church history, there are so many tunnels to go down, and so many, still to this day, even though I've been digging, pretty assertively for a while, there's still new things to discover and new dark corners that get uncovered when you don't realize that the church has done so many different things. And in almost every case, it can be traced back to false doctrines, ideas, and teachings, and harmful cultural aspects of the church. One of the things that you mentioned about getting a new name, when you go and study other groups that people would label cults, that's a very common theme, where when you enter the group, you get a new identity, and that identity binds you to the group, and it helps dissociate you from your past life and your past family that may be otherwise looking out for you, and it severs the ties that you may have to the society, the culture that you were in, and makes you completely dependent upon your new society, your new culture in the group.
Yeah.
And as you correctly observe, it is very manipulative, and it makes it so much harder to escape those systems of control.
It is, and preparatory to receiving a new name, whether it's an Americanized name or a temple name, the work is being put in there beforehand, and that is separating the individual from everyone else. You're a child of God. You are chosen in this lifetime. You have been baptized. You have the truth, the knowledge. Everyone else is on the outside. They need to receive it, but you cannot be like them because you are special. And that is it is very much grooming to alter someone into a tool for your own use. And that has, I think, looking back, when I realized that the church wasn't true, it was absolutely devastating to me. I think for a lot of people who really believed and wanted to believe, it was so devastating. It just felt like this hole, this abyss just opened up underneath me, and it was just this blackness that swallowed, and I didn't know what was my foundation anymore in life. It wasn't the church. And that's what my whole identity was. And that is so scary. And I think that shows how far those roots go, that they alter you so much you don't even know who you are without their existence.
Yeah.
That's scary.
You're describing a very familiar theme of people coming out of the church, where you really, I think Hans Mattsson, who was a 70 in Sweden, who gave a very popular interview with the New York Times, described it as having the ground crumble under his feet. And that's the very confident messages about who we are, why we're here, what is right, what is wrong, and where we're going, that are given by the brethren. Once you take away the idea that the brethren are anything other than what they claim to be, then you're left with having to rediscover those things on your own. Whereas everybody else in the wider world around you evolved naturally into their adult mindset by answering and struggling and wrestling with those questions if they were free from their own indoctrination. And so you kind of have to
Yeah.
start over with that. And it is absolutely terrifying at first, because not only is it the sense of, I don't know, I have to rediscover these things, but then you still have these lingering thoughts of phobias where, am I being deceived by Satan? Am I just, is the adversary having its way with me because he's the great deceiver? There's all these different themes that run through your mind, and it makes it very difficult and very frightening. And so it's always good to hear that people are able to come through that process and find strength in their own inner voice and their own moral foundation outside of false authoritarian decrees.
Yeah. And it is a process. People who have not lived through an experience like this do not understand the amount of mind control that goes on and the identification with oneself. It is absolutely crippling when you do step out of that, and you do find yourself. You will find yourself. It's difficult, and to this day, I still study old religions and mythology and everything, and I find it absolutely fascinating and wonderful. And and I did dive into some of the I can't even remember his name. I have his book in there.
Denver Snuffer. Let me guess. Denver Snuffer?
No.
Oh, okay.
Hold on. And I don't agree with all his opinions and everything. Where is it? It is Richard Dawkins. The God Delusion.
God Delusion. Yeah.
That Richard Dawkins. It was very interesting listening to him and Christopher Hitchens. Their viewpoint. I like listening to different viewpoints. Doesn't mean I agree with 100% of what they say, but just understanding the other viewpoints out there to say that your God is right because they tell you to circumcise your son, to mutilate part of your body, and yet someone who says that their God only has one eye. I just was like, I can see the frailty in what they consider the substance and the base of their God. And, but I appreciate how they, where it came from and try to just take the surface wisdom of what is being said. Sometimes we have to sacrifice a little bit of ourselves to gain some kind of knowledge, but that doesn't mean it has to be a physical sacrifice. It sometimes means stepping away from what has been ingrained in you.
Yeah. And it is it's a very humbling, like it's so ironic that people who leave the church get accused of being arrogant. And I can understand that perspective from the mind of a believer, because if you are separating yourself from the church, then you are saying that you believe that the men claiming authority to speak for God don't speak for God, and you're valuing your own conscience, your own thoughts above theirs. And so they're going to call you arrogant. But I think what the side that they're missing is the fact that you have had to admit that you were wrong, that you were deceived. And it's a very difficult thing to admit, particularly when the church uses this false truth paradigm where it says, you don't have to believe us, just pray about it. And so off you go to have some sort of psychologically manipulated experience that tells you that your own faculties have proven to you the truth of this thing. So you have to overcome your own experiences and realize that you have been deceived. And it is absolutely a very humbling process. And hopefully that humility informs you about, the vagaries of believing other people. And some people would say that it creates a cynic out of you, but I think it's more that it creates a skeptic out of you. And
it does. And, through the process, I did lose my family.
I'm sorry to hear that.
During that time, I lost contact with my sisters. They stopped calling me. My stepchildren and their mother, talked openly with my daughter that I no longer have the Holy Ghost with me, that I'm under the influence of an evil spirit, and it's their justification for what's wrong with me and why you don't go where she's at, because it leads you down a path that you can't return from. Once you're under Satan's influence, you're done.
Yeah.
And you know what, for this journey, I wouldn't take back anything, because it's their choice to step away
Yeah.
and, ostracize me or shun me. I miss my family, I miss my sisters, but I don't miss the thinking that goes involved, where everything is revolving around the gospel. And that was, I'm a much happier person. I never thought that could happen, but I'm a much happier person now, that I can have a cup of coffee and not feel like I'm a horrible person and I can't go into the temple.
So evil.
So it's,
it's
down
funny.
to your eating.
It's funny to hear you. Well, I don't say it's funny, but it's kind of like jarring, because you mentioned that it's only been about 5 years since you left the church. So that would have been about the 2015 era, 2014, 2015. And so the shunning has taken place in that time frame. When we have Elder Holland being interviewed by a BBC reporter in 2012 around Mitt Romney's campaign, where Elder Holland, in this internationally broadcast program, tells the reporter, if I had a member of the church who stopped believing, I would not cut that member, that son or daughter, out of my life. And so you have an apostle publicly saying this to a reporter, and yet there are still family members who do that very thing. If somebody disbelieves, they cut them out of their life. I've talked to people who've been written out of wills because they distance themselves from the church.
Well, and they will be cut out. Even it doesn't matter if an apostle or the prophet comes out and says, "This is wrong." They're still receiving the message that you do not. What is it? You avoid the appearance of evil.
Yeah.
You do not hang around with apostates. And you're even asked during the temple questions for your temple recommend, do you associate or are you friends or belong to anyone that is an apostate or has opposite views of the church?
Yeah.
And I remember doing that, sitting there and saying, well, yeah, my brother's very anti-Mormon and it just breaks my heart, but I don't believe in what he's, it's like you spill your guts. It's like, it reminds me kind of like this is extreme, comparison, but the Nazi Germany, where you kind of rat out someone in your family, like, oh, they're kind of going down this road.
Yeah.
And they try and nip it in the bud. They send more missionaries over there, and I was a ward missionary when I found out that the church wasn't true. So it was huge and powerful. It was a very rude awakening and whatnot. But, the racism, I saw it just throughout my childhood, and the separation and the reasoning behind it. It never sat right with me. It never felt right. And I did push back on it quite often. But you can only go so far.
Yeah.
You can only go so far.
Well, that's one of the things that in a lot of the stories that you've related, there's this latent racist ideas that have continued to flourish in the church, in the minds of older members and conveyed to younger members, that is given room to exist and room to live and thrive because there's no absolute repudiation of those ideas. And I think the strongest thing that we got was really that 2013 Race in the Priesthood essay, where the church actually used the word disavow. But when you read the essay, there's like this weaselly language where it attributes the problems to, prevalent racist ideas in the culture. And what it preserves in doing that, it preserves the mindset that you should still rely on the brethren for your moral framework. And so it continues to place people in the prison of their teachings, so that you are, on other issues other than race, you still can't trust your own conscience, you can't trust your own judgment, you can't trust the love and desires that you may have for your own children if they are gay or lesbian or trans. You can't trust those impulses. You have to rely on the edicts of the brethren. And that's kind of that focus of power in the brethren is something that the church will never surrender. And
Yeah.
like you're
No, they
talking
won't.
about, where you go and you explore other religious traditions after you leave the church, there are people who are able to find other religious traditions that don't force you to place the center of your control and identity in the hands of a hierarchy of authority. And so there's kind of like
Exactly.
a way to find out if the religion does that. If you just Google like the name of the religion and then former Mormon support group, the intensity and the degree to which a religion is harmful and robs you of your own autonomy, you'll find support groups to help people recover from those teachings. So you're not going to
Yeah.
find like Unitarian Universalist recovery support groups, because the whole principle of
No.
that organization is to empower people to discover and act on their own spiritual ideas. They're not robbing you of any identity, but you will find Scientology recovery groups, Jehovah's Witness recovery groups, Mormonism recovery groups, and that's because that is a
Yep.
symptom of the degree of harm and control and overbearing, power that the groups have over the individual, and it robs them of their identity. It snarls their way into their lives as they grow up and they start taking the dogma of the group and integrating it into their own personal self-conception, which makes it more painful when you discover it's false.
Yeah. And one of the things I've noticed throughout history of time and cultures and peoples, the one way to conquer a people and a culture is to consume the religion, to adapt to it, to make them adapt to yours and change it over, and the culture itself, just like, you look at Christianity when it went into the pagan, cultures, they wanted to do away with the pagan beliefs, but they incorporated that into Christianity, like the Christmas tree and Easter eggs and the Easter bunny, all pagan roots. But they knew that they had to, get in there and get a hold, and that's how you conquer. And I think that is one of the ways that churches conquer people, or powers, conquer, is to adapt and decimate, so to speak.
Well, it's kind of like the other side of the coin. There's a lot of celebration going on now because the church seems to have softened its stance on LGBT members. And it's kind of a new modern form of the phenomena that you're talking about, where you adapt to the existing culture and society in order for the religion to continue to thrive and to continue to hold some space. And in Mormonism, that adaptation takes the form, as we're seeing, in adopting some of the social winds of change of the group around them. They're late to do it, but they'll do it. And what that'll allow them to do is, if they see, gosh, the kids these days really love and accept their gay peers. Well, if we can now reinvent Mormonism to create a space for LGBT people, then we can be inclusive of them. And there's a good and a bad side to that. There's the good in that those people now feel included, but love bombing and inclusion and friendshipping as a means of the open door to indoctrination, those are the harmful tactics that any of these controlling groups use. And all they're doing is they're broadening the scope of people that they can then ensnare and start to shape the worldview of. And
you hit the nail on the head. It's all about narcissistic supply. When you said love bombing, that's exactly what it is. Narcissistic supply. We need to get these people in. We need our numbers to get up again. Mm-hmm. When I'd go into the ward missionary meetings, and they had spreadsheets on all the people, and they wanted to assign a membership ID to the children who weren't even baptized.
Yeah.
That made no sense to me. I'm like, well, they haven't accepted it. They're not, they're children. They shouldn't have that on them.
They will accept it.
But in the end, I realized this is just to make, boost the numbers, So it was really sad. And these were people who were, maybe one member of the family was a member of the church, and they incorporated the children into it, and it really made their numbers look good. It was really sad. So,
well, As you say, you just keep digging and you'll find more. Thank you very much for your call. You
Thank
know,
you.
we'll hear from you again sometime in the future. Take care.
Thank you. Keep up the good work. Bye.
All right. All right, let's see here. All right, we've got a comment from David Welsh saying, it's interesting to think that while Udall was fighting from the outside, Hugh B. Brown was fighting from the inside, and they both lost despite America's changes. And this is observing one of the things that you'll discover if you dive into the history of the church on the race issue is Hugh B. Brown was a member of the first presidency of the church at the time when the church was wrestling with these issues of civil rights. America around them was making great progress in coming to the realization of universal brotherhood and extending a system of equality and civil rights to everyone, doing away with segregation. And Hugh B. Brown was trying to make those changes, trying to push for those changes behind the scenes in the church. And the reward that he got for it was at the changing of the guard when the prophet died and the next prophet was put into place. Hugh B. Brown was demoted from being in the first presidency back into being a member of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. And if you've been paying attention to more recent history, you'll see that that has happened again. To my knowledge, it's only happened twice. The first was to Hugh B. Brown, and the second was to Dieter Uchtdorf. And when President Nelson chose his first presidency, he booted Dieter Uchtdorf out from the first presidency back into the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. And some people have speculated, why is this? Is it because Uchtdorf, probably more than any other general authority, has made statements in General Conference acknowledging that even leaders themselves have made mistakes and acted and taught things which were contrary to the truth in the past? That's the speculation that a lot of people have. All right. We have a comment from Charlotte Shelter that says, I left in 2017, and it took me 2 years of unlearning through tears the lies about the gospel and learning the truth when my friends and family believe I am tricked by Satan. And Mormonism is not alone in teaching that people who leave their faith are somehow deceived by Satan. If you talk to former Jehovah's Witnesses, that is the same sort of doctrine that they espouse. And it just has that same effect of coloring how your friends and family will view you for acting on your conscience. When you learn the truth about the information that has been hidden from you, they'll start to see you in a different light, and it will create a distance that is protective of their testimonies. So they're not going to feel as comfortable listening to you or believing things that you say. If you try to share the things that you've discovered with them, they will just assume that you've been deceived by Satan, and they won't investigate it. They won't even consider the implications of things. I think anyone who's been in the church that you talk to is going to probably relate having a similar experience where friends and family that the closest people to you in your life, who you want to share what you've discovered, just in some instances it may be because you want to help them escape systems of control that you now see that they're trapped in. But in many instances, and this is kind of how I feel it, a lot of it is just for self-validation. It's like I want to see that somebody else that I value and love in my life understands why I can't accept these things anymore and still sees me as a good and worthy person in light of that. And that's a pretty deep urge. And it's one of the urges that people who join the church have that binds them to the church when they believe that they've discovered the truth, because they are given a whitewashed and cleaned up sterile narrative that is shrouded in all of the love bombing and other ways that they get you. You feel like you've discovered something. And so it's no surprise that new converts want to share what they've had, but that's a different thing in the modern age where people can Google. All right, so if there are any other comments, you can call at 210-422-2222. I think if we don't get anything in the immediate future, There have been a number of references in these articles to other blog posts. Specifically, I think 3 or 4 blog posts. One of them is certainly the Delbert Stapley letter to George Romney. Another one is the Lowry Nelson exchange. And then a third one would be Joseph Smith versus the abolitionists. And I think that it would be useful to do something similar to this, where we put an audio version of those articles out there just so that you can have consumed them in that format, because they really are, the Stewart Udall sequence is really eye-opening, but having the understanding of those other things which happened in the decades before Stewart Udall wrote this letter really adds some background, because you realize that the brethren are not responding to Udall just like out of nowhere. They have been confronted with the truth of racial equality for years beforehand, and they've knocked it down and demonized the person who brought it to them again and again. And so to see how the brethren interact with those issues just over and over again really gives you some insight into how they are holding on to false, terrible ideas, despite a more loving, empathetic, and universal truth being showed to them a better way. And that's just how it is. So we'll see if we can do that. I'm trying to step up the scale at which I bring these things out there so that so that we can fit more in. All right, we got another call. Hello, you're on Talk on Things and Stuff.
Hey, Jonathan, how's it going?
Good. What's on your mind?
Hey, yeah, so something that came to mind, we were just talking about the leadership structure. I often talk to friends and other people about, when are we going to see some change, or what kind of change would we see? One layer or one aspect of this that comes to my mind is, how familiar are you with the apostolic charge that's given to apostles?
I'm not very familiar with it. I've heard of it. Tell me what your take on it is.
Well, I'm thinking of one particular instance from, I believe it's Hugh B. Brown's book, An Abundant Life.
Okay.
I've heard it mentioned on a few different podcasts. And part of the apostolic charge he says he received was that any of his own thoughts or opinions had to be subjugated to the views of the majority, right? The majority of the apostles. So, any one of the apostles can have their own thoughts or opinions, but at the end of the day, that has to be subjugated to the views of the majority. And there's some line in that apostolic charge that essentially says you have to adopt the views of the majority and essentially own them as your own.
Now, is this apostolic charge a uniform statement where the same charge is given to every brethren, or is it tailored to each apostle?
That seems to be the implication, at least in the quote that I'm thinking of. I should have looked it up, but I'm pretty sure if you just Google apostolic charge Hugh B. Brown, there's a Mormon dialogue topic about it, and it's a quote from his book.
Okay.
Actually, yeah, right here. So the quote is, it says, "Always be willing to subjugate his own thoughts and accept the majority opinion, not only to vote for it, but to act as though it were his own original opinion, after it has been approved by the majority of the Council of the 12 and the First Presidency." Yeah. The relevancy to me is that, when we're talking about these changes and whether or not doctrinal changes will come about, it's important to keep in mind that the way that the authority structure is set up, that change is going to be slow, and it's going to be long and drawn out, to the point where these junior apostles that come in, I'm thinking of somebody like, some of the most recent ones that have
like
been
Garrett
called,
Gong.
like Garrett Gong. Let's say that Garrett Gong has his own views on homosexuality and the policies. He's not going to be able to enact any change for years and years and years, and during that time, he's going to have to subject his own thoughts and his own opinions to that of the majority.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. I've written a couple of things that treat this subject, and it's good that you brought my attention to that apostolic charge because it fits perfectly and it aligns with how Joseph Smith set up the rules of the kingdom. There's an article on the Thoughts on Things and Stuff website called Theodemocracy, or The Anatomy of Theodemocracy. But when you look at the parliamentary procedure equivalent for how the Council of 50 was set up, it's set up to require unanimous support for any decision that the council makes. And when you
Right.
examine each of the points of how a subject is brought up to the brethren, it's brought up only by the president of the quorum, and then when the votes are had, they go by seniority and age. And if anybody dissents from the first vote, which was the vote of the president, then they can state their case, but if they ultimately hold to their dissent rather than subordinating and changing their vote to that of the chairperson, then they are obligated and basically kicked out of the body. And so then they would be replaced by someone who would vote to support the president. And that ensures that any decision will be unanimous. Now, it really is a childish way of thinking about decisions because we saw this when President Nelson first became prophet. He held a special meeting with the youth of the church. And this is the meeting where he reflected on the 2015 policy of LGBT children. And he, affirmed that it was the result of revelation. Well, if you look at the other part of that talk, he talked about what a glorious thing it is that the decisions of the leaders of the church are unanimous. And the idea there, which is very childish and simplistic, is that if a decision is unanimous, then it must be right because there's no dissenting.
Must be the will of the Lord.
Right, exactly. But when you look at, the fact that people have different thoughts, different ideas, different backgrounds, and will approach a subject differently, and the only place in the world where you will find unanimous decisions like that is like, I think, Kim Jong-un in North Korea was elected president by unanimous vote. And if you look at different totalitarian regimes, anytime they have a vote which is supposed to validate their state as rulers of the organization, miraculously, it's all unanimous. But anytime you see where people are supposed to be able to express their free will, and there's a collective of people that express that free will, statistically, it's not going to be unanimous, and rightfully so. As soon as you see that it's unanimous in a situation like that, then that's a huge red flag that some political consideration, and I don't mean political like government, I just mean some incentive system or control system is coloring the decisions or the outcome that's being made so that considerations other than the issue at hand are actually affecting the outcome. And so certainly in, totalitarian regimes like Kim Jong-un or Saddam Hussein, both of whom had unanimous votes, then you can see the system of control that's underlying that. There are some exceptions. So you can't simply say that anytime something is unanimous when there's a group of people, it seems that something is wrong. And we're going to see example of that when we go to the next Stewart Udall sequence. And that is when you compare two different Supreme Court rulings. The first one is Plessy v. Ferguson, and that was the Supreme Court ruling which basically made a federal law of segregation. And you compare that with Brown v. Board of Education, which happened about 60 years later or something like that, which did away with federally sanctioned segregation. So in the first one, in Plessy v. Ferguson, it was unanimous except for one person. And that person is who we're going to learn about next time, but he gave what is called the Great Dissent. And when you read the dissenting opinion of the Supreme Court justice, who was the only one to vote against segregation, it is just this brilliant explanation of why segregation itself is bad. And when you go then and later look at the Brown v. Board of Education, where it was unanimous among the Supreme Court that segregation was inconsistent with the principles of the Constitution and the realities of human civil rights, that was unanimous. But that was unanimous not because of some controlling force, but because the nation had been woken up to the deplorable state of civil liberties in view of the issue of race. And so there are some situations where a unanimous decision is helpful, but if the church is encoding in its apostolic charge that young apostles must subordinate their own conscience, their own opinions to the senior apostles, it simply mirrors the system that Joseph Smith set up, and so that provides further support that his system was a religious totalitarian system of control. But then it really gives a plausible explanation for why the church persists in its errors for so long, because it's basically forced to do so, particularly when they are so old. It takes decades for junior, I'm the junior apostle, but I'm 60. It just takes so long for that to happen. So we're definitely going to check that out. That's a very interesting point.
That's just the point I wanted to make, is that apostolic charge in Huey Brown's book and the implications of that for the church change moving forward. And then the only other recommendation I have is just for your listeners. I don't know if you've had a chance to read The Mormon Church in Blacks, a documentary history by Matthew L. Harris and Newell G. Bringhurst.
I have that on Kindle, and I've used that to reference things. If I remember right, the documentary history books kind of just provide excellent resources so you can see kind of all the different documents that have been the inputs to the decisions of the apostles, and then the things that eventually came without it. So that's that's in my Kindle reference, absolutely.
Yeah, it's amazing the amount of politicking that happens behind the scenes.
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, thanks for letting me call in. I just want to make that point.
Excellent. Thank you very much for the call. Talk to you soon.
All right, you got it. Take care. Bye.
All right. So we've got a comment from John Robertson. David says, changes to the priesthood ban were most assuredly influenced by the pressure from the U.S. federal government. Oh, if it was Wilford Woodruff, then that would have been changes to the policy on polygamy. And I think most historians that look at the situations regarding the official declaration that came out ending polygamy, and then the follow-up declaration that came out really ending polygamy, will acknowledge that it really was in response to pressure by the federal government as Utah was wrestling with, becoming a state, being incorporated into the union, and the demands and expectations that the federal government had, that it abandoned things that were just politically unfit and socially unfit for how the nation had developed. So, all right, I think with that, we'll go ahead and end here. We don't want to make it too terribly long, but if you made it this far, I appreciate you for hanging around. And until next time, where we will see how the fruit of Mormon doctrine affected the life of Stewart Udall in comparison with how the fruit of several other faith traditions shaped and formed the conscience of other individuals. And I think it's a very eye-opening comparison. It's one of the favorite things that I ever wrote. So I'm really looking forward to sharing that with you. So until next time, talk on things and stuff.